Having listened to the piece, you might hear why I was initially reticent to work with this music. In contrast to many of my other transcriptions, including Nider's March from the same story, it's a stretch to say that the music here contains a Dalek theme. Even Simpson's other major attempt at Dalek music, from Season 4's The Evil of the Daleks, succeeds at having an actual melody. Nevertheless, there is coherent Dalek music in Genesis, but it's more like a motif, or more precisely, a chord, an orchestration, and in some cases, a rhythm. A big part of the Dalek sound is made from harsh crashes on the tam-tam, a percussion instrument in the same family as the gong and the cymbal. This is a sound Simpson first explored in his Planet of the Daleks score from Season 10, but it reaches perfection here. If you know me by now, you won't be surprised to hear that I incorporated a piano interpretation of the tam-tam into the suite, using a thick cluster of sounds, sometimes incorporating my entire hand. The notation is the same as I used for similar clusters in the Keller machine. The score of Genesis of the Daleks is orchestrated with the Simpson standard: horns, tenor sax, clarinet and contrabass clarinet, piano with a notably prominent part, organ, synthesizer, mallet percussion, and percussion. A strong part of the Dalek chord is from a repeated synthesizer sound, using the timbre of a tritone separated by an octave. Since my hands cannot stretch farther than they do, I had to compress these tritone sounds to a single octave. The body of the Dalek chord is made from powerful bass pulses by the horn ensemble, very often held as longer tones compared to the repeated rhythmic pulses of the synthesizer. Also, the buzzing of the tam-tam and the pounding of the timpani and piano. There is also a strong rhythmic element to the Dalek sound. Sometimes a duple march, sometimes triplet rhythm, and sometimes the mechanized horror of both simultaneously. Let us return to Skaro at a point in time before the suite evolved. Like any good Terry Nation story, the first appearance of a Dalek is reserved for the cliffhanger to Part 1, and the first two measures of the suite are based on this brief revelation. As Davros flicks a switch on his control panel to activate the Mark III travel machine, the horns crescendo on a tritone. Since the tritone is such a diabolical interval, you'll hear a lot of it in the suite, for it is an integral part of the Dalek chord. This is joined by the contrabass clarinet and is presently joined by the timpani, imitated by a tremolo at the bottom of the piano. Although these latter sounds are very deep in the bass register, together they outline the chord F7 flat 5, which is another common harmony in the suite. A naked tritone, jumping up almost an octave, is supported by the tam-tam sound to underscore the Dalek's first appearance. After experimentation, I decided upon the following notes for the tam-tam. My thumb on a high G natural, followed by the rest of my fingers and the palm of my hand smashing every note from A natural up to E natural, creating a powerful wash of 9 chromatic notes that are held as long as is audible. When I was first transcribing this music, my next chosen cue was from Part 2, when the Dalek enters the laboratory at Davros's command. As I continued work and began having concerns about the sound and the overall structure that this piece would take, I sought out contrasting material to intersperse with the on-purpose, mechanistic, repetitive music of the Daleks. The music I needed was immediately at hand. Earlier in the same scene, as Davros enters the laboratory, he has, like Nider, his own succinct theme, brassy and oppressive. Rather than focusing on the Dalek music alone, I have kept the 2 musical cues from this long scene intact in the suite. Davros enters with something of the greatest importance to say, and his short theme is made of 2 elements: Above, the horn ensemble in a series of 4 chromatically descending major triads, first starting on G major, and after a repetition, beginning again on A major. These chords are played neither legato nor staccato, basically eighth notes and eighth rests, alternating. This is an important differentiation between the pulsing staccato bass of the piano underneath. When I discovered its structure, I was even more pleased to have included it in my suite, for it forms the skeleton of the Dalek chord. Made of 4 zigzagging bass notes, there is a false sense of a triumphant major chord, for 3 of the notes create C sharp or D flat major. By now, you know that my favorite word associated with Simpson is subvert, for the 4th note is D natural. Oh yes, subverting that major sound and creating D diminished major 7 harmony. That's what it sounds like by itself. But when combined with the descending major triads above, the picture of Davros's authoritarian grip, as well as his horrific appearance, is complete. There is a terrifying bite to each of these chords. For while the major chords sound right by themselves, when combined with the left hand, they sound disturbed. When these major triads come to rest on G flat major, the left hand's bass zigzagging continues unabated. And when the triads sink further down to E major, delayed by 2 beats, the downbeat of the bass is shifted over to the highest note, C sharp. While Davros delivers his speech to the assembled scientists, this pattern of 4 bass notes continues relentlessly but quietly underneath for 7 measures. It is most unusual for me to include such repetition in my transcriptions, for music obviously included as a vamp to fill space doesn't always make compelling solo piano music. Simpson makes it clear in his score, however, that soulless, implacable repetition and unwavering certainty characterizes Davros and his Daleks perfectly. Davros's only functioning hand trembles across his control panel, and as he moves towards a switch, there is a series of muted horn 2-note lines that resolve warily into 3 tritones. As the switch is activated, there's a dramatic chord supported by pounding timpani and piano, made entirely of Davros's 4 relentless bass notes. The timpani and piano continue independently, briefly, before the Dalek enters the room. The Doctor recognizes it instantly, and as he explains it to Harry, scientist Ronson corrects him, having never heard the word Dalek before. Here is the first appearance of the Dalek chord, based on the same harmony outlined in the bass of Davros's theme. With the rhythm suddenly shifting to triple meter, the shimmering keyboard timbre, with its devilish tritone interval, seems to mimic the Dalek voice's harsh grating. Underneath, the piano responds to the horn and keyboard pulses with a tritone heartbeat of its own. Altogether, this first Dalek chord is about as dissonant as we ever hear in Simpson's music. The music pauses, during which Davros demonstrates the improvements he's made. At his prompting, Nider and another scientist, Garman, attach a weapon to the Dalek's casing, completing the design. The music resumes at that prompt, with a brief recall of Davros's theme, the same descending triads, heard longer now and only once, underneath timpani rolls. The final Davros chord, in tremolo with the left hand's timpani, crescendos and then a crash, a half-step transposition of the Dalek chord, as the gunstick is revealed. As the shock dies away, the right hand reaches over to play a quiet timpani pulsing, echoing the heartbeat heard earlier. One of the horn notes, F sharp, bends up to G natural, and I wish I could imitate that effectively on the piano, but I kept it simple and undistracting. While the gun is attached, there is a quiet, tension-filled unison line by the horns, occasionally punctuated by the timpani heartbeat. Then, as Davros's trebling hand again reaches for a switch, this time releasing the Dalek to its own self-control, there's a series of 3 trills and tremolos in the piano and vibraphone. When the switch is activated, we hear essentially the same dramatic sting that introduced the Dalek chord earlier in the scene. Following this, however, is a slight alteration. Only the treble notes are up a half step, while the heartbeat tritone remains wedded to D natural. This alters the harmony to D major, flat 5. As the Dalek surveys the scene, eventually rounding on the 2 aliens, we get 5.5 measures of this Dalek chord, again in triple rhythm. The Dalek declares its intention, nay desire, to exterminate the Doctor and Harry, and we get a series of tension-building sounds, all centered on D natural. When Ronson daringly intercedes on their behalf, deactivating the Dalek, there are some shocking horn attacks based on E minor, with a hint of the octatonic scale. After they peak, the timpani and piano smash down in a final echo of the Dalek chord, again landing back on D natural. Based on this musical introduction, Daleks are in D minor. The next large sequence of music comes from the pivotal scene in Part 4, where, having witnessed the destruction of the Khaled Dome, Davros summons his Daleks and sends them on their mission of vengeance, first exterminating Ronson, the so-called traitor. Introduced by a falling line in the horn and piano, this section, heard as the Daleks enter and surround their creator, features another alteration of the Dalek chord into a thicker quartal harmony and the shifting of the timpani heartbeat up to E natural, which reinforces the octatonic sound. That's to say nothing of the return of the tam-tam chord from the introduction. So this entire structure makes for a massive and terrifying sound. After 4 measures of this, the right hand must leave behind the tam-tam to begin a trilled B-flat lodged in the middle of the Dalek chord. The entrance music ends with the chord shifting up a minor third, answered by the timpani, then the resumption of the piano trill, briefly solo. As Davros gives orders, the horn ensemble has a series of rising triads, and as they peak, the timpani brings things to a deafening silence, during which Ronson becomes the first human ever to be exterminated by a Dalek. The Daleks reassemble around Davros to hear his rallying cries, and the Dalek chord resumes, but this time it has resolved anew to a more triumphant D-flat major, with added tritone, sharp 11, G natural, still present. Through this passage, which passes through E minor, back up to D-flat major, you can hear the difference between the more staccato synthesizer sound, the timpani and piano heartbeats, and the longer tones of the horn ensemble. Once again, the piano resumes a long continuous trill, this time on C sharp and in the bass register. The horns slowly unfold a series of rising harmonies, largely in the interval of a minor sixth. These suggest a major triad on their own, but here is made more suspenseful by the trilling pedal note below. The piano pounds out the conclusion to this intense passage, and with the familiar strain, "We Obey," the Daleks depart the laboratory, and the Dalek chord resumes its more dissonant version from the opening of the scene. Both the horn ensemble and timpani and piano heartbeat are more rhythmically intense to send the scene out. Later in Part 4, the Fall's jubilant celebration is cut short as the Daleks cry exterminate and begin murdering everyone they find. The beginning of this passage marks another alteration of the Dalek chord, for the constant tritone above is accompanied by dominant 7 flat 5 harmonies, beginning on D flat and sinking down to C natural. After a brief pause on G sharp diminished 7, the first Dalek opens fire to a scream of B minor with floating tritones above. This is the sort of music I have always dreaded because to unpack the music during screams, cries of exterminate, Dalek guns, and dialogue makes for torturous work. It took me many repeated hearings to discern not only the falling tritones, but the repeated staccato horn chords wedged smack in the middle of the Dalek Ray's sound effect. These are the sort of passages where, try as I might, I probably missed something. But if I can't hear it, I can't hear it. The next three measures are famous, in a way. They accompany the brief scene where the Doctor hears the melee in the distance, peeks around a corner, and grabs his new friend, Beton, as she runs from the rampage. A major reason this is famous is because a synthesizer realization of this passage accompanies a segment of the 2005 Making of documentary, where voice artist Roy Skelton teaches us how to speak Dalek. The first half of this passage is very clear, but towards the end, the low notes of the piano get buried by the ambient noise. I must have listened to that passage hundreds of times. I was pretty sure I got it. Then, although it felt like cheating, I went to the Making of documentary and listened. There, this ending sounded completely different than what I thought. Apparently, the gentleman who did this music had access to Simpson's scores, something I envy enormously. I went back to the program one more time, listened many more times, and concluded. What was written in the score did not happen in practice. There are, in fact, several examples of slightly imperfect recordings that ended up being the final product. So perhaps this is my own arrogance, but I gotta go with what I hear in the program. That was always the point. The program was the primary source. After all that discussion, this A natural minor passage features the piano and tenor sax playing a jaunty triplet melody up and down. At the end of the passage, it's taken over by the horn, which seems to resolve to A minor. This last measure is a bit of a mystery to me as well, obscured again because a Dalek ray gun and a screaming human covers it up. I am convinced that there's more there, and again, there's a lot more going on in the documentary's realization. Since I can't hear it, however, I'm not going to guess, nor compose what I wish was there. Happily, these problems were few and far between, and as we cut back to the Daleks regarding piles of dead bodies, the opening passage of this scene resumes. This time, the first two chords repeat an additional time. While the Doctor and Beton duck out of sight, the horns and synthesizer briefly fade, resolving from G-sharp diminished 7 to B-flat with added sharp 11. From this brief moment of repose comes 11 measures of some of my favorite music that Simpson ever wrote, underscoring as the two watch from the shadows while three Daleks glide by in search of their next victims. Beginning with a terrifying crescendoed octave line at the bottom of the piano, again solidifying E natural as our new Dalek bass note. This music proves to be a development of the Dalek chord, expanded with some varying horn harmony. Beginning with the original D diminished harmony, the horns move compellingly to E minor, then G sharp minor, while the tritone above, anchored to G natural and C sharp, is the link to the original Dalek sound. To conclude, the timpani has a brief solo, and the segment comes to rest on the recently heard B-flat major with sharp 11, a transposition of the triumphant Dalek chord. A few seconds later, a two-measure clip of the D major flat 5 in triplet rhythm accompanies a cutaway showing another trio of Daleks searching. This music exactly recalls the segment from Part 2 when the Dalek is given self-control. Despite this clip's brevity, it nicely segues to a late scene in Part 4, where the Doctor and Beton are resting in a trench. As the Doctor leaves, Beton cowers as she spots a Dalek above her. This is a quieter, suspenseful contrast, with quartal harmonies in the right hand, while the left hand reaches over to play a pared-down reprise of the tam-tam chord. Suddenly, we are thrust into Part 5, in the scene where the Daleks in the burning Thal city exterminate one last human, then receive orders to return to Davros in the bunker. With an erupting D-flat major sharp 11, the triumphant Dalek chord, a fleeing Thal runs into a Dalek, and it's the last thing he does. After a quick shift to D minor, representing the running human, the music of extermination flickers between the positive of D-flat sharp 11 and the negative of C-flat sharp 11. A second Dalek approaches the first and announces the command to disengage, and after this monotonous conversation, the two Daleks depart. Because of their voices and sound effects of the city aflame, this music was quite difficult to hear, but fortunately was simple by necessity, so I could work it out. The synthesized upper notes set a staccato pulse in fifths and octaves, while the horn ensemble emits low, ominous sounds, also in fifths and octaves. As they depart, the music crescendos and ends with a dissonant chord of two adjacent tritones. The next musical clip in the suite comes from early in Part 6, as the Daleks are returning to the bunker. After some traveling music, they stop at a sealed metal door awaiting Davros granting them entry. Again, the implacable march mécanique returns, as we get 8 measures of an identical groove. This is a condensed version of the Dalek chord, an octatonic sound, not easily defined, with a new bass note rooted on G. Suddenly, after a skip of half a beat, we get 3.5 measures of a new harmony, with a shift to triplet rhythm. This is the D-flat with sharp 11 harmony, but the piano heartbeat alternates with B-flat. As the Daleks reach the metal door, the music lands off balance on a sudden C minor, whereupon it becomes sparse in support of the Daleks patiently waiting at the door, then cut to Davros and Niter meeting with the rebels. Niter whispers to him, and Davros activates a switch, opening the metal door. While the C minor chord rings, there's 2 sets of repeated buzzing keyboard tones, adding the major 7th, with a quiet timpani beat in between. Both are played by the right hand. Back at the meeting, the harmony changes to E dominant 7, with a hint of the whole tone scale. Then, with tritones and a rolling timpani underneath, Davros opens the door for his Daleks, and they advance. The march resumes, here in 6/4 time, and yet again the 3 parts, keyboard melody, horn chords, and piano and timpani marching beats, had to be integrated together. So, although the horn notes are held long in the recording, I had to integrate their notes into the marching left-hand chords. The entire segment is in the E octatonic scale, picking up the same root note from the lead-in passage, and reaching a climax on an almost pure E major chord with the tritone A sharp added for a juicy, evil dissonance. As the Daleks advance into the bunker and Beten, Severin, and their band of fighters follow up behind them, the music is dubbed with a diminuendo, so these climactic chords are very quiet in the mix. However, I have brought them to the fore in my arrangement. Only the last 2 measures of concluding suspense is played softly, hinting at augmented harmony. Next in the suite is the music later in Part 6, where Davros reveals his treachery, allows his Daleks to enter the laboratory, and surround and exterminate the rebels. With low horns heralding their arrival, the piano engages in long trills, while the synthesizer buzzes dominant 7th flat 5 chords. Each harmony seems to signal the arrival of a new contingent of Daleks from a different door. The exterminations begin, and the horrific, relentless music pounds out first a dissonant B major chord, which is largely quartal, for 3 measures, and follows it up with the return of the original D diminished Dalek chord for 5 measures. Underneath, the extreme low register drumming is the same harmony as above, but these notes are largely of my own interpolation. To climax, the Dalek chord rises up a minor third, and as the last rebel is exterminated, and after a short musical breath, a B diminished chord crescendos to resolve on B minor. The coda of the suite begins with the climactic scene in part 6, as Davros, realizing his willful creations have turned against him, attempts to destroy the Dalek production line, but he is exterminated, or so it seems. The B minor harmony continues, very colorful and dissonant with the major 6th and the sharp 11. The horns trill their own tritone harmony beneath, which I executed as best I could. Most of whatever music going on underneath Davros's agonizing death screams wasn't audible, but there is a solo organ chord, D-flat major with sharp 11, the triumphant Dalek chord, that emerges as that fades, which I play after a respectful silence. A final timpani heartbeat filters through, and the organ chord slightly resolves, the D-flat sinking to C natural. The final strains of the suite are a fulfillment of a musical fantasy of mine, the invincible operatic horn and timpani music that underscores the final frenzied rant of the entombed Dalek never ceases to work me into a frenzy as well. So I decided to try and make a workable piano version for the suite's finale. To be clear, there are organ chords also going on in this segment, but they are essentially inaudible. I'm not sure I could have integrated them into this part anyway, so I ignored them. The doubled unison horn line, full of searing long notes, again suggesting the key of B minor, was easy enough to hear and execute. To give them the power they deserve, I play them in octaves in the right hand. That wasn't the challenge then. It was this: could I possibly do justice to the bravura timpani solo that accompanies this line? Hammered out in incessant triplet rhythm, this part seems improvised. And what really makes it for me is the percussionist using the timpani's tuning pedal to bend the notes while performing. This creates a brilliant, unhinged sound. Choosing specific, discrete pitches did not seem to be the point of this timpani part, so I decided to compose my own part, emphasizing the notes of the Dalek heartbeat sounds heard throughout the score: B, D, F, and G sharp or A flat. I used simple chromatic scales with the damper pedal down to create the sense of pitch bending and the sound of drumming filling the ears. Reaching fever pitch, the terrible pounding of the drums subsides into several final, specific notes in quarter-note triplet rhythm, followed by a super low final pound as the horn line concludes above. Though in the program this music soon fades away into the goodbye scene, for this suite I could not resist ending with a bang. The long, ringing notes at the end are deliberate, as you and I both revel in the carnage. They dare you to listen until they disappear. I hope the sounds of Dalek chords and Davros themes will continue to ring in your ears. But wait, there's more. Tune in next time for part 3, the score to Music of the Daleks. Subscribe, like, share, and comment. See you then.